Friday night. Ryan Cole reclined the driver's seat of his old Toyota Camry and pretended he was only resting after a late shift. Then at 2:13 in the morning, the headlights of a black Bentley cut straight through his fogged windshield. A billionaire woman stepped out frowning the moment she recognized the man curled up inside that battered sedan as the most reliable employee in her company. What froze her wasn't the fact that he was homeless. It was the reason he had never told a single soul. For 9 years, Ryan Cole had walked into the lobby of Sterling Tower at 6:45 every weekday. Shirt pressed, boots clean, the plastic ID badge clipped to his belt, still showing the photograph the company had taken back when his hair was darker and his eyes weren't yet carrying the weight of 2 long years. He didn't talk about. He kept his head down at the security desk, nodded to the guard on duty, and took the service elevator to the sub-basement, where the building's mechanical systems hummed behind walls of gray steel. He was 38 years old, and the men he worked with thought he looked closer to 45. He didn't correct them. He had stopped correcting most things about himself a long time ago. Ryan was the technician they called when nothing else worked. An elevator stalled on the 32nd floor, with 3 executives inside an HVAC failure during a summer board meeting, a power surge that almost wiped out the trading floor on the 12th every time somebody picked up a phone and said, "Get Cole." And within 10 minutes the problem was gone, and he was back in the sub-basement, drinking lukewarm coffee out of a thermos. What none of them knew was that the thermos had quietly become his only kitchen. He filled it from the staff coffee pot on the 2nd floor every morning, and most days it was the only thing warm that went into his body until he refilled it again at noon. 42 floors above him, Evelyn Sterling was already at her desk. She had been there since 5:30. She drank black coffee from a cup that cost more than Ryan's monthly grocery budget, and she scanned quarterly projections with the same expression she gave everything in life: measured, neutral, unimpressed. She was 45, and she ran Sterling Holdings the way her father had taught her to run anything worth keeping. Names didn't matter to her. Stories didn't matter. What mattered was whether the system worked, and a good chief executive maintained her components without falling in love with any of them. She had never spoken to Ryan Cole. She had passed him once in a hallway 18 months earlier and had not registered his face. To her, he was a signature on a service ticket. To him, she was a name printed on the side of the building he worked inside every day. That was the entire shape of what they were to each other, and neither of them had ever expected it to be more. The trouble had started the previous year on a Tuesday afternoon in a lawyer's office on West Madison. Ryan had signed the last page of a divorce settlement he didn't fully understand. The marriage had ended months before, but the paperwork had dragged on, and the legal fees had eaten through everything he had saved across 15 years of steady work. By the time the ink dried, he owed 3 different attorneys 2 credit cards he hadn't touched in a decade, and a bank that no longer answered his calls. He had tried to fix it the way men like him always tried to fix things: extra shifts on weekends, side jobs fixing furnaces in row houses on the south side. He had cut his own meals down to 1 a day, then to coffee and whatever the break room had left over. He had asked the bank for 60 more days, then 30, then 2 weeks. He had been polite every single time. He had used the word "please" in places where the word didn't belong. None of it changed the date stamped on the foreclosure notice taped to his apartment door. On a Sunday in October, Ryan loaded everything that mattered into the trunk of his 1998 Toyota Camry: a duffel bag of clothes, a heavy toolbox, a watch he no longer wore, a gray blanket he had owned since he was 22. The rest he left for the building manager to throw away. He stood in the empty living room for almost a minute before he turned off the light. He closed the door, locked it out of habit, and slid the key back under the door because there was no one left to hand it to. He drove to the parking lot of a 24-hour pharmacy 3 blocks from Sterling Tower, killed the engine, and reclined his seat. He told himself it would be 1 night, maybe 2. Long enough to think. That was the first night. By the second morning, he had a routine. He woke at 4:45 before the cleaning crew arrived at the back entrance of the building. He used the staff bathroom on the second floor to wash his face, brush his teeth, and run cold water through his hair until it lay flat. He kept a small bottle of detergent in his locker, the kind sold in single-use packets, and he washed one shirt at a time in the sink while the soap was still foaming on his hands. He hung the shirt to dry inside his locker on a wire hanger. By 6:45, he was at the security desk, again, badge clipped and presentable, smelling faintly of industrial hand soap and nothing else. He was good at the disappearing part. He had been disappearing inside his own life for 2 years already. The car was only the most recent stage of it. The trick he had learned was to keep moving in straight lines and to keep his voice flat when anyone asked how the weekend had gone. People stopped asking after a while. That was the whole point. By the third night, the cold had moved into the seams of his coat and refused to leave. His lower back ached when he stood up in the morning, and his fingers had developed a small tremor. He hid by keeping his hands inside his pockets whenever he wasn't holding a tool. He had stopped tasting food. He ate because the body needed fuel the way the Camry needed fuel, and for the same flat, unsentimental reason. He slept in increments, an hour at a time. 2 if he was lucky. He woke at every passing car, at every gust of wind that rocked the chassis, at every dream that surfaced, and then sank back down before he could see what was in it. By the third morning, he was running on something thinner than sleep, and he could feel it in the way his hands moved across the tools half a second slower than they should have been. The fourth night was the one that nearly ended it. He came back to the pharmacy lot a little after 11 and found a tow notice taped to his windshield. He drove west on Lake Street with no destination, watching the streetlights blur across the hood. He tried a public lot near the river, and a patrol officer tapped his window at 1 in the morning and waved him on. He tried a residential block in Bucktown, and a homeowner came out in a bathrobe and stood on the porch, staring until Ryan put the car in drive. He ended up behind a closed warehouse on Dom and slept 90 minutes, with his coat pulled over his face, and was back at Sterling Tower at 6:45, looking exactly the way he had looked every other morning. That was the day the mistakes began. He misread a voltage gauge in the electrical room and pulled the wrong breaker. The lights on the 8th floor went dark for 4 minutes. He recovered fast restored power before anyone filed a complaint, but he stood there afterward with his palm flat against the panel and felt his hands shaking in a way they had never shaken before. 2 hours later, he forgot to log a routine inspection and had to backdate the form, something he had never once done in 9 years. That night, the 5th one, sitting in the Camry with the engine off and his breath turning to mist against the windshield, Ryan understood what the next step was going to be. He could walk into the Human Resources office in the morning and tell the truth. He could say the words out loud, "I lost my apartment, I'm sleeping in my car, I need help," and let the company decide what to do with him. He knew how that would go. He had watched it happen to 2 other men over the years. A quiet meeting, a polite severance, a handshake, and a security escort to the lobby. The official reason was always something else, or he could keep doing what he was doing. Wash the shirt, press the collar with his palm, show up at 6:45 and pretend the world inside the Camry didn't exist. He could keep that up for 1 more week, maybe 2. After that, his body would decide for him. He chose the second option. He chose it the way a drowning man chooses to keep swimming, even when he knows the shore has moved farther away. He turned the heater on for 90 seconds, just long enough to take the worst of the cold off the glass, then shut it down to save fuel. He pulled the blanket up to his chin and closed his eyes and listened to the wind move across the empty lot. High above him, in an office where the lights stayed on past midnight, Evelyn Sterling was on a call with a bank in Hong Kong about a deal worth $2.5 billion. She did not know his name. She did not know his car was 300 feet from the window, where she was standing. She would not know for another 24 hours. The sixth night began the way the 5 before it had begun. Ryan parked in the rear lot behind Sterling Tower a little before 10. The rain had started a few hours earlier and hadn't let up, and the gate that usually stayed open until 11 was already locked when he tried to leave at 10:30 to find a quieter spot. He sat behind the wheel for a long minute, looking at the chain stretched across the exit, and then leaned his head back against the headrest and laughed once short and dry. There was nowhere else to go tonight. He would stay where he was, and whatever came of it would come. He thought about that for a few seconds, about how the sound he had just made wasn't really laughter, just the body's last, polite way of acknowledging a joke. It had stopped finding funny, and then he closed his eyes. The temperature dropped 4 degrees in an hour. The windshield fogged from the inside, and rain hammered the roof so hard it sounded like someone tapping a knuckle on metal over and over. He pulled the blanket up to his shoulders and tried to disappear into the noise. Somewhere on the floor near his right boot, the thermos rolled half an inch every time a gust of wind hit the side of the car, and the small, repetitive sound of it eventually became the only thing he was aware of. 40 floors up, Evelyn Sterling was in a glass conference room, arguing with 3 men in dark suits about a hotel chain on the West Coast she wanted to acquire. The deal was worth $2.5 billion, and it was unraveling at the edges. The chairman of her own board, Daniel Whitmore, sat at the far end of the table with his fingers laced on top of a leather folder, and he had been disagreeing with her for 9 straight days. "You're going to overpay Evelyn," Whitmore said, "and the market is going to remember that. We've had a good run. Don't burn it down because you fell in love with a deal." Evelyn answered the way she answered everything that touched a feeling she didn't have time for. She tightened her jaw, set her pen down at a precise angle to her notepad, and said, "I don't fall in love, Daniel. I close." The men around the table laughed politely. Whitmore did not laugh. He watched her, and she felt the watching land somewhere just under her ribs, and she pretended not to. The call ran until 1:40 in the morning. She had stopped going home before midnight months ago. The penthouse on the 39th floor of the building across the street was empty in a way that her office was not, and she preferred a leather chair with 3 monitors over a kitchen no one cooked in. There was a particular silence in that penthouse at night that she had stopped being able to sit inside. When the call ended, she stood at the window and looked down at the street for a long time. The rain was hard enough that the street lights below blurred into rings of yellow, and she watched them for almost a minute before she turned away. Then she told her driver she wanted air. At 2:13 in the morning, the headlights of a black Bentley swept across the rear lot and stopped 6 feet from Ryan's driver's door. Evelyn's driver had pulled around the back of the building to avoid the press of late-night traffic on Wacker, and the headlights had found a single car parked alone where no car was supposed to be at that hour. Her first instinct was to call security on her phone. Her second was to step out and look. She did the second thing because something about the way the windshield was fogged, not from a running engine, but from breath, the slow kind, the kind that came from someone sleeping, caught her in a place she didn't have a name for. She walked 3 steps and saw the badge on the dashboard. She read the name. She read it again. Ryan Cole. She remembered in a flat, administrative way that this was the name on the technical service log she had signed off on at 9 that evening, the man who had brought the electrical system back online in her own private elevator earlier that day. The same man whose hands she had not seen, whose face she had not looked at, whose existence had been a checkbox in the right column of a service report. She stood there in the rain in a wool coat that cost more than his car, and for the first time in a long time, she was not thinking about a deal. She was thinking about her father. Walter Sterling had been a foreman at a steel plant in Gary for 31 years. When the company let him go in the spring of 1987, 6 weeks after a heart attack that had kept him in a hospital bed for 9 days, he had come home and sat at the kitchen table in his work jacket and not said a single word for the rest of the afternoon. Evelyn was 6 years old. She remembered the jacket and the way her mother had stood at the sink with her back turned the entire time, and the way her father had eventually gotten up and made his own coffee, because no one else was going to. He had spent the next 4 years driving a delivery truck for half the money. He had never once complained out loud. He had also never been the same man again. Evelyn had built every part of her life around the silent promise that she would never be a person something like that could happen to. What she had not built was any room for the thought that it might be happening right now, 3 feet on the other side of a windshield, to a man whose name she had only just read off a dashboard. She knocked very lightly on the glass. Ryan came awake, the way men in his situation come awake. Fast, alert, embarrassed before he was even fully conscious. He saw the silhouette through the fog and rolled the window down 2 inches out of reflex. He saw the face on the other side, and the 2 inches felt suddenly enormous. "Miss Sterling," he said. His voice came out steady, which surprised him. "Mr. Cole?" she answered. "Are you hurt?" "No, ma'am. I'm fine. I was just resting before my shift." "It's 2 in the morning. Your shift starts in 4 hours. Ryan didn't have an answer for that. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel because looking at her felt like a thing he didn't have permission to do. There was a small watermark on the dashboard where the thermos had leaked, and he found himself staring at it as if the stain were something he could clean later, as if there were going to be a later in which that mattered. Evelyn stepped back from the window. She did not call security. She did not offer him the back seat of the Bentley. She did something he was not expecting at all. She walked to her car, took a thermos out of the door, pocket-walked back, and set it on the hood of his Camry. Then she said very quietly, "I'd like to talk to you tomorrow. My office. 4 o'clock. Not as your employer. Just as a person who saw what she saw." She walked back to the Bentley. The door closed. The headlights swept off across the lot and were gone. Ryan sat there a long time before he reached out and took the thermos off the hood. It was still warm. It was black coffee, and there was a folded note tucked under the lid that said only, "Don't leave the city. E.S." He did not sleep again that night. He sat with the thermos in both hands until the warmth was gone from it. And then he sat a while longer, holding the empty metal, because he could not think of a single thing in the world he wanted to do next. He went to her office the next afternoon. He took the service elevator up to the 42nd floor and stood outside the glass door for a full 10 seconds before he made himself open it. He sat in a chair across from a desk that was larger than the kitchen of the apartment he had lost, and Evelyn Sterling sat across from him with her hands folded on top of a leather folder, and she said, "I want to help you, Mr. Cole. Tell me what you need." Ryan was quiet for a long count. Then he said the only honest thing he had said out loud in 2 months. "I don't want your help, Miss Sterling. I appreciate the coffee. I appreciate you not calling building security. But I'm not a project. I'm a technician. The day I take a check from you that isn't tied to a service record is the day I stop being either of those things." Evelyn looked at him the way she had looked at Whitmore in the conference room 3 weeks before. The same level eyes, a different feeling behind them. "That's pride, Mr. Cole." "Yes, ma'am. It's also the only thing I still own." She let him go without arguing. She let him walk out of the office and back down to the sub-basement, and she sat at her desk for another 2 hours and did not open the folder she had brought up for him to sign. At one point, she got up and stood at the window and looked down at the rear lot from 42 floors up, and she could not pick out which car was his. That bothered her more than she expected it to. It would have ended there, maybe if not for Daniel Whitmore. Someone on the cleaning crew had mentioned a car in the back lot. The story had moved up through the building in the way stories do, 1 floor at a time, until it reached the chairman's office on the 41st. Whitmore was a man who collected information the way other men collected watches, and the next morning he had a name and an employee file and a 1-page brief on his desk under a heading that read, "Reputational Risk Building Services." He brought it to Evelyn at 10. He laid the page on her desk and tapped it twice with 1 finger. "We can't have this, Evelyn. We have analysts walking through that lot. We have investors. A man sleeping in a Camry 40 feet from the front entrance of Sterling Tower is not a story we want anyone telling. He has to go. Today. Quietly. A severance and a handshake and an escort to the door. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She looked at the page and she looked at Whitmore and she said, "I'll handle it." "Today, Evelyn." "I said I'd handle it." Whitmore left. She closed the door behind him. She stood at the door with her hand still on the knob for almost half a minute before she let go. Then she walked to the personnel system on her own terminal and pulled the full record on Ryan Cole for the first time, and she read it from the beginning line by line. She read that he had not taken a vacation day in 9 years. She read that he had taken the night shift on Christmas Eve 4 years in a row without being asked. She read that in March of 2020, when a transformer fire on the 14th floor had nearly cost the company a federal contract, the technician who had walked into the smoke and shut the system down by hand was Ryan Cole, and that he had filed no incident report afterward because he did not want overtime and did not want recognition and did not want anything except the next morning to come back to work at 6:45. She closed the file. She closed it slowly the way you close a door in a house you are leaving for the last time. That same evening, the 6th night since Ryan had first parked the Camry in a lot 3 blocks from the building, was also the last one he would spend in it. In a parking lot 4 blocks east of Sterling Tower, the Camry's engine turned over, once coughed twice, and went silent. Ryan turned the key 3 more times. Nothing. The temperature outside was 26 degrees. He had $41 in his wallet. His phone, when he looked at it, showed a message from Human Resources informing him that he had been placed on administrative leave pending review. He sat in the dark in a car that would not start on a night that was not going to get warmer, and he understood with a clarity he had been holding off for a long time that there was nothing left to lose. He set the phone face down on the passenger seat and watched his breath turn the air in front of him into something he could almost touch. The Bentley found him a little before midnight. Evelyn had been driving the city for almost 2 hours by the time her headlights swept across the dark lot behind a closed hardware store on Ashland. She had told her driver to go home at 10. She was at the wheel herself in flat shoes and a wool coat she had not bothered to button, and she had checked every parking spot within a mile of Sterling Tower before she thought to try the smaller streets to the east. She had not driven herself through the city in almost 6 years. The streets felt narrower than she remembered, and the traffic lights stayed red longer, and twice she missed a turn she had taken 1,000 times in the back seat without ever once looking out the window. She saw the Camry, first then the silhouette behind the wheel perfectly still, and she pulled in beside it and killed the engine. Ryan watched her get out. He didn't roll the window down this time. He opened the door instead and stepped out into the cold, because some part of him understood that whatever this was, it wasn't going to be handled through 2 inches of glass. She didn't ask if he was all right. She didn't pretend not to see the dead engine or the breath misting around his collar. She stood about 3 feet from him with her hands in her coat pockets, and she said the first true thing she had said out loud in maybe 20 years. "My father lost everything when I was 6. The company he gave 31 years to put him out the door 6 weeks after a heart attack. I spent my whole life telling myself the reason that happened was because he wasn't strong enough. That if he had worked a little harder, or saved a little smarter, or been a little less proud, none of it would have touched him." Her voice was steady, but it was not the voice she used in conference rooms. "I watched you walk into my office yesterday and turn down a check, and I went home and sat in my kitchen for 4 hours. And I realized I've been wrong about my father for 39 years. I built a company on top of that wrongness. I built a life on top of it. I have been protecting myself from a thing that was never really the danger I thought it was. And I have been treating the people who work for me like the danger instead." "Swan." Ryan didn't answer right away. He looked down at his boots, then back up at her, and his jaw worked once before he could get the words out. "I was too proud to ask anyone for anything, Miss Sterling. Not because I thought I could fix it on my own. I knew I couldn't. I just couldn't stand the way people look at you once they know. Like you're already gone. Like whatever they're saying to your face is just the polite version of the thing they're going to say about you in the hallway later. He drew a slow breath. I would rather sleep in that car for the rest of the year than walk into a room and watch somebody decide I'm a sad story. Evelyn nodded once. She did not move closer. She did not touch his arm. She said only, "Then we're not going to make you a sad story. We're going to do something else." What she did over the next 48 hours was not what Daniel Whitmore expected. She did not write Ryan a personal check. She did not put him in a hotel suite at the company's expense and call a press contact afterward. She walked into the boardroom on Monday morning at 8 sharp with a one-page proposal already drafted, and she put it in front of 7 men in dark suits before any of them had finished their coffee. The proposal had a name at the top, the Walter Sterling Emergency Fund. It outlined a confidential financial assistance program available to any employee of the company at any level janitorial technical executive. It didn't matter who found themselves in a documented housing or medical crisis. No public announcement, no press, no requirement to disclose the recipient's identity to anyone outside a 3-person review committee. The fund would be capitalized at $4 million annually drawn from the chief executive's discretionary budget. Whitmore read the page twice. Then he set it down on the table and looked at her across the polished wood. "Evelyn, this is a sentimental decision." "No, Daniel. A sentimental decision would have been writing a single man, a single check, and calling the newspapers. This is a policy." "And the man in the parking lot, reinstated this morning, promoted to manager of technical operations as of the next fiscal quarter. He's earned it twice over, and you know he has. If anyone on this board has a problem with that, I'd like them to say so to my face right now." The room was quiet for a count of 5. Whitmore looked at her another long moment, and then he picked up his pen and signed the bottom of the page without another word. The other 6 followed him. None of them said anything to her when the meeting ended. 2 of them shook her hand on the way out, which was something they had never done before. Ryan did not learn about the fund from Evelyn. He learned about it from a letter on company stationery that arrived at the temporary corporate housing unit on Hubbard Street, where he had been moved on Sunday night. The letter was 4 paragraphs long, and it did not have her signature anywhere on it. It outlined what the program was, what he was eligible for, and the fact that his participation would not appear in any personnel file accessible to anyone outside the 3-person committee. It was signed by the Human Resources Director. He read it twice. He folded it carefully and put it inside the front pocket of his toolbox, where he kept things that mattered. The months that came after were quieter than anyone watching from the outside would have guessed. Ryan paid down the first credit card in November. He paid down the second in January. The Toyota Camry went to a salvage yard in February. The man at the yard offered him $300 for it, and Ryan took the money without arguing and walked the 6 blocks back to the train in a coat that finally fit the weather. He bought a used Ford pickup for $3,200 and drove it home from the lot in the rain, feeling for the first time in 2 years. Like the rain was a thing happening outside of him rather than to him. By the following spring, he had moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Logan Square with a window that faced east, and he had a key on a ring in his pocket again. And the small, ordinary weight of that key against his thigh as he walked to work in the morning was a thing he never stopped noticing. He noticed it the first time he locked his own door behind him in a way that felt almost embarrassing. He noticed it 3 months later when he stopped noticing, which was its own kind of milestone. He took the promotion. He was good at it. Within 6 months, 3 other technicians under his supervision had quietly accessed the same fund, one for a medical bill, one after a fire, one after the same kind of divorce that had nearly broken Ryan. None of them knew about each other. None of them were ever asked to be grateful for anything in public. The committee approved each application within 48 hours and did not ask questions that weren't on the form. Evelyn changed too in ways that were harder to see from the outside, but that the people in the building started to feel. She learned the name of the woman who cleaned her office on Tuesday nights. She started leaving her door open for 30 minutes every Friday afternoon for anyone in the company who wanted to walk in without an appointment. The first month, only 2 people walked in. By the 6th month, the line started forming at 3:45, and her assistant had to put out chairs. Whitmore retired the following summer. The board voted in a younger chair who agreed with most of what Evelyn was doing, and the things he didn't agree with, she did anyway. She and Ryan never became friends. They were not the kind of people who become friends. But twice a year, on the anniversary of the night in the parking lot, and again at Christmas, she sent down a thermos of black coffee from the 42nd floor with a note that said only, "Still here. E.S." He kept every note in the front pocket of the toolbox with the letter. A year and 3 months after the night the Camry's engine had died, for the last time, Ryan was driving home from a late job at the Sterling Tower satellite building on Halstead. It was a Thursday in March. The rain had started again, the way it had started that night. Soft at first, and then harder. And he took the long way home out of habit past the closed hardware store he had not been back to since. The lot was nearly empty. There was one car parked in the far corner, a beat-up Honda with the windows fogged from the inside, and a young man behind the wheel staring at the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Ryan slowed the truck. He looked at the Honda for a long count. He thought about driving past. He thought about how easy it would be to keep going, how the rain was getting heavier, how he had a warm apartment 8 minutes north, and nothing in this lot belonged to him anymore. He pulled in. He shut off the engine. He sat there for 10 seconds in the quiet, and then he got out and walked across the wet asphalt toward the Honda. He stopped beside the driver's door. He could see the young man's eyes through the fog, and he recognized the look in them in a way he wished he didn't. It was the same look he had seen in his own rearview mirror every morning for 6 straight days, a little over a year ago. The look of a man who had stopped expecting the next hour to be different from the last one. He raised his hand and knocked very lightly on the glass. "Hey," he said, "you all right?" Because sometimes what saves a person isn't money. Sometimes it's just the fact that on the worst night of their life, somebody stopped the car and bothered to ask. Sometimes that's enough to start everything else. Art.